Good morning, everyone. It's a beautiful Sunday morning. Welcome to Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago. My name is Chak, and I'll be your moderator today. We have a great talk lined up for you. Hopefully, most of you got a vaccine already or about to. So once we do that, hopefully we'll get to meet in person again in the upcoming months. For now, obviously, these programs are virtual. Hope in the next couple of months, maybe we'll get back to in-person gatherings. So today we have an interesting talk by Andrew Stulman. Andrew is a professor of psychology and cognitive science at Occidental College in LA. He studies conceptual development and change, particularly as they relate to science education. He holds degrees in psychology from Princeton and Harvard, and he's the author of Science Blind: Why Our Intuitive Theories About the World Are So Often Wrong. It's a pretty interesting topic that we're going to be touching on today related to the book. There you go. There is the book title is up there. So before we jump into the topic, I do want to chat a little bit about humanism as it relates to Ethical Humanist Society. We think of humanism as a rational philosophy that is informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion, all three key elements. Usually our Sunday talks cover a wide range of programs. Based on the title, you could tell this is related to our science topics. So the topic itself is called Science versus Intuition: Why Scientific Ideas Elude the Human Mind. So I'll give you a brief summary and then turn it over to Andrew. Science ideas are difficult to teach, difficult to learn, and difficult to accept as true, because they often contradict our intuitive theories of how the world works and looks to us. Often these theories are constructed in the childhood, but retained across the lifespan as we grow into adults and influence our thinking. Andrew will talk about what intuitive theories are, where they come from, and why they blind us to more accurate theories of the world. His book is available at online or your local bookseller. With that, let me turn it over to Andrew. There you
go. Great. Thank you for having me. Occidental College is in Los Angeles, so I am talking to you from my backyard in Los Angeles. And today we're going to talk about a topic that it's always relevant, but it seems like particularly relevant right now with vaccine hesitancy. So I'm not going to focus on vaccines, but we can definitely talk a lot about those in the Q&A. All right. So you're probably aware that Americans are not big fans of science. When people do polls of science topics, what people understand about science, you find that millions of Americans think that dinosaurs coexisted with humans, even though dinosaurs died out 65 million years before humans emerged. Millions of people think that the Earth's continents are fixed in place and don't actually move, that there are different genes in different parts of the body. So you have genes for your eyes and your eyes, genes for your toes and your toes, and not vice versa. Lots of people are confused about atomic structure. They think that atoms are smaller than electrons rather than the other way around. And many, many people think the sun revolves around the Earth rather than the other way around. So that's the state of science understanding. People are also actively hostile towards science. So these same polls find that millions of Americans deny that humans have evolved from other organisms, that humans have changed the climate and are continuing to change the climate, that humans have walked on the moon, that genetically modified foods are safe to consume, and that vaccines are safe to receive and to give to your children. And of course, we've also seen that science is politicized. When I first started doing research, the main hot button issue was evolution education. And then it became climate change, and now it's vaccines, but and it's genetically modified foods. There's always something. Here's an old tweet from our former president where he's linking vaccines to autism, which is a bogus connection. But now we have another vaccine controversy on our hand, whether it's safe to receive the COVID vaccine. So why is science misunderstood, mistrusted, rejected? The most common explanation that people give is that science has to compete with religion, particularly in a religious society like America. You have an alternative view of how the world works. And that view is very common. It's endorsed by the people around you. And so you have an explanation for things like the origin of species, and you don't need some other explanation. So for instance, on this slide, you can see an evolutionary account of the origin of species as evolving through descent with modification. But the creationist account is that they were just created in their current form instantaneously by a divine being. There's definitely truth to this idea that science competes with religion in the minds of individuals. Religious individuals are less likely to understand some topics in science and less likely to accept science. But it's really conservative ideology more generally, and includes conservative politics. But I'm not going to talk about that tension today. I'm going to talk about a different tension, which is between science and intuition. So here on this slide, I have some illustrations of two models of how humans are related to other primates. The one on the left is the scientific concept, where we're all related through common ancestry. In fact, all organisms are related to all other organisms through common ancestry. It's not just humans and primates. But that's an idea that most people don't quite get. Instead, they're more likely to adopt the intuitive model on the right-hand side, which depicts this linear goal-directed metamorphosis, where monkeys metamorphosed into apes, apes metamorphosed into cavemen, and cavemen metamorphosed into humans. This intuitive conception you can see all over the places is probably a more common depiction of evolution than the cladogram on the left. But it's not supernatural. It's not religious. There's nothing religious about it. In fact, if you take a strictly religious view of humans' relation to other organisms, you would deny that humans are related to apes and monkeys. So this alternative idea isn't grounded in religion. It's grounded in something else. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So as was nicely advertised at the beginning, I've written a book all about intuitive theories and how they interfere with our reasoning about how the world actually works. The way the book is broken up is that I talk about intuitive theories of the biological world and intuitive theories of the physical world. And it's not as if we have one intuitive theory. We have many intuitive theories that are specific to specific kinds of phenomena. But before I talk about that, let me just explain what an intuitive theory is. So before we learn scientific theories of natural phenomena in the science classroom, we construct our own explanations for how things work. We don't sit passively by and just wait to be instructed. There are plenty of phenomena that hit us in the face and that demand explanation. We're surrounded by heat and light and gravity, illness, death, aging, growth, all sorts of things that we would like to be able to explain. And we don't even wait to explain these things until we're adolescents and have a few facts under our belt. We start right in early childhood. So these structures are called theories by people in my field, that is cognitive developmental psychologists, because there's a striking resemblance to scientific theories. They function in many of the same ways that scientific theories do. They help us explain events from the past, predict events in the future, intervene on present events to bring about the outcomes we desire, and reason counterfactually, reason about events that didn't occur, but what would happen if they did occur, or what antecedent conditions could we bring about to then allow those events to occur. But these structures are called intuitive theories as opposed to proto-scientific theories, because the intuitive is meant to set them apart from scientific theories. They're less precise and they're less accurate than scientific theories. And what I hope to convince you of is that in many cases, they are qualitatively different from scientific theories. So they carve up the world into a set of entities and processes that don't accord with science and in fact don't accord with reality. They're helpful in the moment, they're helpful in the context in which we experience a lot of natural phenomena, but they're not ultimately correct. So we form intuitive theories of basically every phenomena that you would then learn a scientific theory for in the science classroom. So for instance, we form intuitive theories of matter, energy, gravity, motion, the cosmos, and Earth, or geology, as well as biological phenomena like life, growth, inheritance, illness, adaptation, and ancestry. Really, when people have looked at how children and novice science students understand any given topic, they've always uncovered an intuitive theory there prior to mastery of a scientific theory. So where do these theories come from? They have at least three sources. One source is evolution. We have some innate ideas about how the world works. We don't come into the world as total blank slates. We expect there to be certain things that we're going to interact with, like objects and agents and heat and light. So for instance, it looks like young infants innately understand that objects are solid, cohesive, and move on contact with other objects. You don't have to learn what an object is. You come into the world expecting there to be objects, and you know a little bit about what they're like. And the way that psychologists know this is from experiments with young children where you capitalize on something they're doing anyway, which is looking at the world, and they look longer at things they don't understand than at things they do understand. So you can show them two kinds of events that are closely matched, one that conforms to the laws of physics and one that violates those laws. And then you look to see if the infant looks reliably longer at the event that violates those laws, the impossible events. And in many cases, they do. From 3 months of age, indicating that they have early knowledge of these laws. So what's being illustrated here is an experiment where an infant is familiarized to a fan going back and forth on a stage and nothing behind it, just going back and forth. And then the experimenter puts a block down behind the fan, and the infant sees one of two things. Either the fan moves back and then stops where the block should be. They don't actually see the block, but they're inferring that it's there, and that won't let the fan pass through. Other infants actually see the fan continue on its pathway all the way to the bottom of the stage. And the infants who see the impossible event look reliably longer than those who witness the possible event, implying that they understand that objects continue to exist even when out of sight, and they're solid. They don't allow other objects to pass through them. Another source of input into intuitive theories is experience. Some ideas we don't know innately. I mean, the majority of ideas we don't know innately. We have to learn through observation or firsthand exploration. So one of these things that we have to learn on our own is that unsupported objects fall. It's possible that infants could have had that knowledge innately. I mean, we're surrounded by gravity. It would make sense that that might be something evolution would select for. But people have done experiments where they familiarize infants to a ball dropping and landing on a table. And then they remove the table and they drop the ball. And in one case, the possible case, the ball comes to rest on the floor. And in the impossible case, it comes to rest in the air, just floating in midair. And people find that infants do not reliably look at the floating object more than the one that came to rest on the floor, implying that gravity is just not something that's built in. We have to learn about it. And the kinds of experiences that are critical to learning about gravity are dropping objects, watching objects fall, and then dropping objects yourself. And this is a slow developmental progression that happens throughout the first few years of life, that infants are slowly learning more and more about support relations, when an object is supported and when it's not. And the final source of input is culture, what the people around us have to say about the world. Science is transmitted through culture. We wouldn't have science if we weren't able to share information and store information in written form. But that's not the only source of input. We also have cultural input about intuitive ideas that are non-scientific. So for instance, lots of people hear from the other people around them that being cold can make you catch a cold. But that's actually a folk belief. There's no causal connection to coldness as a temperature or state of being and catching a cold. It's germs that cause colds. Being cold can maybe make you stressed and exacerbate your immune system. So there might be some indirect link, but coldness in and of itself doesn't cause you to catch a cold. So that leads me into the limitations of intuitive theories, which is that they're wrong. They're not totally wrong. We construct them because they are helpful. But when you go to the science classroom, what the instruction you receive isn't just an elaboration of your intuitions. It's usually information that directly contradicts your intuitions, because those innate categories oftentimes, and those early experiences oftentimes set us down the wrong path. And we construct somewhat elaborate explanation that doesn't line up with how scientists currently understand the world. And another limitation is that once you have an intuitive theory, you tend not to realize that you're operating with it. People aren't usually cognizant of their own theories. That's part of the reason why I wrote Science Blind, is to help people recognize the theories that are guiding their reasoning across different domains. And if you have one of these intuitive theories, it's explanatorily satisfying. It works for you in many everyday situations. So it leads you to be blind to counter evidence. And you tend to ignore examples of cases where your theory fails, even when you're receiving direct instruction from a science teacher. So I want to walk through a series of hallmarks of intuitive theories, what sets them apart as a distinct cognitive structure, as opposed to just a random set of beliefs. There's a deep claim here when psychologists call these structures theories, because they not only function like scientific theories, but they're also coherent. They also provide an internally consistent way of looking at the world. Intuitive theories have their own logic. So I'm going to walk through these hallmarks in general, and then I'll illustrate them in the context of a specific domain, projectile motion. So intuitive theories are historically ancient. If you look in the history of science, usually the first theories that scientists articulate when they're trying to understand a topic are just versions of their own intuitive theories. And those early articulations resemble, usually quite a lot, the intuitive theories that science students hold when they enter a science classroom and have yet to receive any science instruction. They are culturally universal, so everyone shares the same innate biases in terms of how we perceive the world and carve it up. And there are a lot of experiences that everyone will have regardless of the particular geography where you live. Heat is heat, regardless of whether you live in the US or India or China or wherever. There will be some variations across culture that's driven by different culturally specific beliefs that kind of round out the corners of the intuitive theories, but the core of those theories tend to be the same across cultures. These theories are resistant to counter evidence. So you can watch something before your eyes that directly contradicts your theory, and oftentimes you'll ignore what you've seen, or you misinterpret what you see through the lens of your theory. These theories are resistant to counter instruction. So when teachers create activities to try to get students to learn the scientific topic of the day, oftentimes those activities fail. They can lead to maladaptive attitudes and behaviors when applied to situations outside of the context where they were originally created. So they're very useful for explaining everyday situations that we encounter. That's why we created them in the first place. But when you then take them and transport them to a novel situation, they can lead to suboptimal or maladaptive attitudes and behaviors. And finally, they don't ever seem to be erased. When we acquire a scientific theory, the outcome seems to be that we've now acquired two theories. We retain the intuitive theory, but we also have a new scientific theory. And the end state is a process of juggling and coordinating the theories, as opposed to the scientific theory erasing and supplanting the intuitive one. Okay, so let's talk about each of these hallmarks in the context of projectile motion, or how to understand objects when they're in free fall. They've been flung into the air, and now the only force that's acting on them, like this person being shot from a cannon, is gravity. Gravity, in combination with the object's velocity, will create a nice parabolic path, from the launching point to the point where they hit the ground. But this is not how the average person thinks about projectile motion. It's very counterintuitive to think that the only thing acting on that object is gravity. the way we intuitively explain motion is we think that when an object is set into motion, there's some external force like a push or a pull that is imparted to the object itself that becomes an internal force. And the label that's used in this literature is impetus. The object acquires an impetus, and that's what keeps it moving at a distance when it's no longer in contact with, say, the cannon that shot it into the air. And then the idea is that the object remains in motion as long as it has its impetus, but the impetus is going to dissipate over time, either on its own or possibly because it's overcome by some other force like friction or gravity. So you can see this view very plainly when you ask people to draw the forces that are acting on an object, a projectile, at various points in its trajectory. So everyone knows gravity is acting on the object. They tend to indicate gravity at all points in the object's trajectory, but they also draw a second fictional force, the impetus. And they tend to draw it as a larger force at the beginning of the object's trajectory. And then at the apex, they'll draw it as equivalent in strength to gravity. And then as the object's falling, they depict the force as shrinking away. In fact, many people think there's a point at which gravity will totally overcome the impetus and it will fall straight down. It won't continue on a parabolic path. And that's never the case. Objects never just fall straight down. So let's go through the hallmarks. Let's talk first about historical antecedents. Here we have a depiction of projectile motion that was drawn back in the Middle Ages. It is the trajectory of a cannon shot from a cannonball, and it's broken up into parts, and at the different parts they're explaining how gravity relates to impetus, with the expectation that by the time you get to like point D, the cannonball's impetus will have dissipated and the cannonball will fall straight down. So notice that these medieval theorists would have seen cannonballs shot from cannons, but they either misconstrued what they perceived to fit into this theory, or they misperceived it altogether. They somehow thought they saw a part of the trajectory that was a straight drop as opposed to a fully parabolic path. These theories persisted for hundreds of years. Even Galileo held an impetus view of motion. He had a treatise that was all about motion, de motu, or on motion. And this is how he explains motion. The body moves upward, provided the impressed motive force is greater than the resisting weight. But since that force is continually weakened, it will finally become so diminished that it will no longer overcome the weight of the body. So impressed motive force is that intuitive notion of an impetus. The way that we know that impetus theories are alive and well in the minds of science students today is primarily by asking them to draw the trajectories of objects. So for instance, here's an owl carrying a rat, and when it drops the rat, where's the rat going to go? Or here's a ball rolling off a table. When it leaves the table, where is it going to go? And the correct answer is the solid arrow in both cases, a parabolic path. But people draw non-parabolic paths reliably all over the place. I mean, these studies have been done in China, Mexico, Turkey, Israel, the Ukraine, the Philippines, the US. Everywhere you ask people to do this, they tend to draw non-parabolic paths. So in the case of the rat being dropped, the most frequent response is to depict that it will fall straight down, because they think that the rat has no impetus of its own. The owl has an impetus, but the rat's just being carried. So they think the only force acting on it is gravity, and it will just fall down. For the ball rolling off the table, they do think it must have impetus. Whatever set it in motion is now inside that ball. But they think there's some point at which the impetus will be drained out of the object and it will fall straight down. And if the ball is rolling really fast, they also think that for a few moments, maybe a few milliseconds after the ball leaves the table, it will travel horizontal to the ground without falling at all, because the impetus is so strong at that point that gravity will not affect it. Of course, that never happens. It will start falling as soon as it's left the table. And that belief is, in fact, what happens to Wile E. Coyote when he runs off a cliff. If people saw this happen in a cartoon, they would be surprised by it. But when predicting the motion, they still make this prediction. There'll be some point at which it doesn't fall. Here's another task that reveals impetus theories. When you, if this person is flinging a ball around their head on a lasso and then releases the ball, the way it will fly off is in a straight path tangent to the curve at the point of its release. But many people think it's going to move off in a slightly curved trajectory because the thought is that it has acquired an impetus from being flung around, and that impetus is a curved impetus as opposed to the straight impetus of the ball rolling off the table. And so it will continue to move in a curved path. They think the same thing if you shoot a ball through a curved tube, that rather than exit the curved tube along a straight path, they think it will continue in a slightly curved manner. And you see this in all cultures where people have administered this test. All right, so when people actually watch objects move, they often fail to realize that what they're seeing contradicts their theory. So a correlated belief to the ones that we've been talking about is that heavy objects fall faster than light ones because the weight of the object gives it an extra impetus. But you can set up experiments, like science teachers frequently will have students roll balls down ramps, one heavy, one light, all the other variables being the same. And the point of the experiment is to demonstrate that the weight of the ball doesn't influence how quickly it rolls down the ramp. And they'll hit the bottom of the ramp at the same point. But students can conduct this experiment and run dozens of trials where they observe from themselves that there's no difference between the balls, but that won't change their conviction that heavy objects fall faster than light ones. If the lesson is not properly scaffolded by the instructor, there's ways that you can use this kind of experience to get people to change their beliefs, but just witnessing the event on its own is insufficient. In one experiment, people watched objects being shot through a curved tube and then come out the other side along a straight path. They weren't predicting anything. They just watched it. And then once the event was over, they were then asked to draw the path the ball took. So it's now a memory test. It's not a prediction test. But still, people tend to draw curved paths, even having just witnessed the ball come out along a straight path. And the longer the gap between witnessing the event and then drawing the trajectory, the more likely people are to draw curved paths, indicating that their impetus expectations will slowly overwrite what it is they just saw. Physics instructors have come up with lots of ways to try to teach people Newtonian principles. The most common strategy is to get them to do solve lots of problems in a problem set, where you learn to apply equations that correspond to Newton's laws to specific situations and solve for, given some variables, solve for others. It turns out that this activity is really helpful in learning how to apply equations to situations and doing the math, but it's not helpful in terms of changing people's qualitative understanding of motion. So there was one study that was done in China where this drill and kill method is very common. Students will solve thousands of physics problems in the course of their physics education, and they found no correlation between the number of physics problems solved and their accuracy on a test of motion that tapped into a qualitative understanding of where objects go. So they were revealing impetus-based misconceptions rather than the correct conceptions that are assumed by these physics problems. Other kinds of instruction also seem to be unhelpful, again, if not framed properly by the instructor. Sometimes instructors will involve their students in micro worlds where you interact with objects in worlds that are set up to abide by Newtonian principles. And then you can interact with them in ways you might not be able to in real life and take measurements that you might not be able to take in real life. So there's this one game called Enigmo where little droplets of water are emitted from a receptacle at the top of the screen, and then they're bounced along drums. And the challenge for the person playing the game is to position the drums so that they ultimately fall in a receptacle at the bottom of the screen. And the trajectories that the water droplets take are fully Newtonian, they're fully parabolic. So you would think that after playing 6 hours of Enigmo, you do pretty well on drawing the trajectories of falling objects, released from a pendulum or dropped onto a table. But it turns out that 6 hours of playing Enigmo is ineffective at changing the way people respond to these tests of qualitative understanding. That is, people who play 6 hours of a game that has nothing to do with physics respond just as accurately as the people who have been involved in this micro world. Moving now to maladaptive consequences, you can set up situations where you're asking people to interact with objects in ways they've never done before. So here's a task where subjects were asked to drop a ball into a trash can. The trash can's not actually depicted here. And they couldn't throw the ball into the trash can. They had to walk briskly past the trash can and just release the ball. And so now the only thing the participant has to decide is when to release the ball. The correct thing to do is to release the ball prior to you actually getting to the trash can, being next to the trash can, because the ball is going to have the same horizontal velocity that you do and will fall in a parabolic path. But most people release the ball, or many people release the ball directly over the trash can, assuming that it has no impetus because you were just carrying it, and they assume it will fall straight down. But it falls in a parabola and then overshoots the trash can. Here's another situation you can set up where people interact ineffectively with objects. Here, you're being asked to shoot a hockey puck through a curved tube, and the correct thing to do is depicted on the right-hand side, where you shoot it on a straight path through a path that actually connects the entrance and the exit. But many people think that if they move the puck in a curved motion before releasing it, they'll impart a curved impetus to the puck. And so it will move through the tube along a curved path. But that doesn't happen. As soon as it's out of your hands, it follows a straight path and then it gets stuck inside the tube. And then the final hallmark, apparent permanence. People have done studies with physics experts, people who have PhDs in physics, where they've put them into fMRI machines, functional magnetic resonance imaging machines, or brain scanners, and look to see what's going on in their brains as they make judgments about physical events. So for instance, you can show physicists heavy objects and light objects falling in a vacuum. That's what you're told to imagine. And they have to judge whether or not the events they see conform to reality. So in some cases, the two objects fall at the same rate, hit the ground at the same time. In other cases, the heavy object falls faster and hits the ground prior to the light object. And physicists do very well at this task. They recognize that the objects should fall to the ground at the same time, and when they don't, that's a mistake. But what happens in their brains at the moment that they're making these correct judgments is that they're recruiting areas of the brain that are involved in inhibition and conflict monitoring. So the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is shaded in the top part of this brain diagram, DLPFC, and the ACC, anterior cingulate cortex, which is in the interior of the brain, shaded in the bottom part of the graph. Those are areas that we know are involved in monitoring errors and suppressing an erroneous response, which implies that even though the physicists are scoring perfectly on the outside, inside they seem to have to inhibit a misconception that heavy objects fall faster than light ones. So this latter kind of finding, which has been replicated using lots of different tasks and lots of different populations, suggests that we need to think about learning in a new way, learning science in particular. The old metaphor for science learning was restructuring, that you would restructure your knowledge in the same way that you restructure a house. And if you thoroughly remodel your house, the initial floor plan of your house is no longer evident. All that's there is the new floor plan. But a better way of thinking about science learning is a palimpsest. Palimpsests are these documents where one text is written underneath another text. They were very common during the Middle Ages when parchment was scarce, and monks who were charged with transcribing documents would reuse old parchments and they would take these parchments and try to scratch off the old text before inscribing a new text on top. But quite often you could read the old text under the new one. And that seems to be a good way of thinking about how scientific knowledge is written on top of, or maybe next to, intuitive knowledge, but it's not totally overwriting the prior knowledge, the intuitive theories. So now let me end with some implications. First of all, this research on intuitive theories has implications for education. Instructors need to recognize that their students will enter the science classroom with intuitive theories, and they should learn about those intuitive theories in the course of trying to acquire scientific theory. Students should be led through activities that help them articulate their theories and recognize what kinds of predictions and explanations are produced by those theories, and then show how those explanations and predictions are inconsistent with a scientific theory of the same domain. But the latter set of findings, that scientific theories, intuitive theories never go away, suggests that science instructors have an additional challenge, which is getting students to understand that some of the beliefs and behaviors and attitudes they've formed are grounded in intuition, and that those ideas need to be scrutinized and possibly set aside, there's new behaviors and attitudes that could be formed on the basis of science. So, when you're outside the science classroom, there's always the chance of defaulting to an intuitive theory and acting what you think is a good course of action, when in fact it's based on a theory that you would explicitly reject if it's pointed out to you. But intuitive theories have implications beyond the science classroom. They have implications for consumer behavior. I only talked about projectile motion, but we have intuitive theories of everything, including phenomena that are related to genetic testing, gene therapy, fertility treatments, pasteurized foods, genetically modified foods. And if we rely on our intuitions, it often leads to the wrong course of action, the suboptimal course of action. So for instance, in the case of GMOs, it's become a fad to mark things as non-GMO because there's so many consumers who are skeptical of GMOs, thinking they're unsafe. But here we have a bottle of salt labeled as non-GMO, which is ridiculous because salt is inorganic. It doesn't have genes, and thus those genes couldn't be modified. They don't exist. So the fact that it's a common practice to label salt as non-GMO suggests that people don't truly understand what it means for a food to be genetically modified. Intuitive theories have implications for our health and the behaviors that we take to minimize health risks. So intuition's a poor guide for making decisions about getting vaccinated, using antibiotics, losing weight, donating organs, and avoiding infectious disease. Here is a poster that was created by healthcare workers in South Africa, where they're trying to spread information about AIDS and AIDS transmission, and at the same time combat folk beliefs and superstitions about other ways that you can get AIDS, including witchcraft. And witchcraft aligns with our intuitive understanding of illness, where it's a very simple causal chain where one person inflicts you with a disease. The biological reality of a disease like HIV and AIDS is much more complicated and much more nuanced. And then intuitive theories have implications for public policy. We live in societies where we are being asked to make decisions that are in some ways deeply scientific, that touch on complicated technologies. But oftentimes we lack the relevant science to really understand what we're being asked to decide on. So we have to recognize that intuition can lead us astray when we're making decisions about whether or not to teach evolution in the public schools, whether to do research on stem cells as a way of understanding the biology of cells more generally, whether or not to engage in cloning and what restrictions we should put on it, what restrictions should be placed on genetic engineering, and how can we combat climate change, and even whether climate change exists. Here we have a image of Senator James Inhofe, who brought a snowball onto the floor of the Senate to make the argument that climate change isn't real, because if it can snow outside, then it can't be so warm that that winter doesn't exist anymore. And this is an argument based totally on intuition. Climate change results in extreme weather, not only an increase in temperature. But I imagine it was persuasive to some of his colleagues and constituents. So to conclude, I want to pick on Galileo one more time. I picked on him earlier as being an impetus theorist. So he made another quote in another book where he said, all truths are easy to understand once they are discovered. The point is to discover them. But Galileo is wrong. There are many truths that are not easy to understand. And they're not easy to understand because they defy our earliest developing and most easily accessed intuitions about how the world works, our intuitive theories. So if we want to understand these truths, we have to address the intuitions that can be an obstacle to accepting them, both in the science classroom and outside that classroom. And that is all. I'll open the floor to questions.
Thank you, Andrew. That was an interesting talk. I particularly love the example of Wile E. Coyote going off the cliff and falls down vertically. That's a really good example that I still remember watching those cartoons. So we will take a brief musical interlude at this point. We will have question and answers after that. Please incorporate your questions. Make sure you have a real question in there. Put them in the comment section on YouTube, and we will basically pick them up. We will break for a few minutes for a brief interlude. During this time, while you're thinking up questions, please feel free to donate at Ethical Humanist Society. You can go to our website and you can donate through a credit card, or you can even use Zelle. There you go, the link is up. We suggest a donation of about $5. We're essentially using these donations to organize all of these talks and the other important work that the society is doing. So come up with your questions, and then we will reconvene in a few minutes. Welcome back. So we will go through some questions. I see some questions are coming up already. So feel free to keep adding more. We have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. And before we start, Andrew, I would like to compliment you on your background. It's great. It's great to be you're participating from sunny California from an outdoor. Hopefully, more people will do this as we get into summer. So let me start with a couple of questions. I think the first one, I think this came in earlier during the talk itself. You talked about the experiment where the infants were essentially looking at the fan that was going back and forth with the perceived blocker. Somebody was asking an evidence for, what is the source of the experiment when we did the block fan and the gravity ball experiments?
The person who did the fan experiment was Renee Bailarjian and her colleagues. She works at the University of Illinois. And then there's a whole spate of experiments that have been done by Liz Spelke and her colleagues at Harvard. If that person is actually interested in hunting down the source, you can email me and I'll send you the papers.
Great, thank you. That'll be awesome. Again, looks like somebody is doing it locally in Chicago, University of Illinois. That's great. There is a question about, is there a distinction between intuitive theories and implicit biases that we carry with us?
Yeah, I do think they're different. A lot of implicit biases are based on sort of a database of experience where there are stereotypes that are implicit in those experiences, the way that certain groups are portrayed in films and on television and media coverage, kinds of interactions that you've had that have been coded in certain ways, or and that's going to be true of intuitive theories. They're grounded in experience as well. I think one important difference is that a bias tends to be more associative, like you have positive feelings or negative feelings towards a person or an object, whereas an intuitive theory embodies a whole logic to it. It's a causal theory about what kinds of events cause other events. And when you get into that kind of reasoning within the social world, then you can have intuitive theories of the social world that might be connected to your implicit biases, but also might be different as well. I mean, you can have intuitive theories that are not necessarily negative in nature. But I focused on science, but there's actually people doing this work in other domains where they're comparing and contrasting scientific theories of human behavior, human interaction with the theories we develop on our own.
Yeah, that's a fascinating answer. Again, a really good question. So let me summarize a few other questions that came about on intuition. I think a couple of them were around, like how do you identify intuitive theories that are unique to us that we might have a blind spot for, right? And the a related question to a certain extent is, how do these intuitions generally come about? I know you talked about it early in the topic. Maybe you can dig a little bit deeper into that as well.
I think that it's nearly impossible to discover an intuitive theory in yourself without knowing what the contrasting theory is, right? If it's just a theory, if there's not like a better alternative. So the first place to start would be with my book, where you can learn about intuitive theories. But I think scientists, especially people who are doing public outreach talks, are oftentimes highlighting points of discrepancy between the science and how people are thinking about these things from a common sense point of view. So they're not necessarily using the phrasing that I did and calling them intuitive theories, but a lot of common sense beliefs are in fact antithetical to science. And I think beyond just recognizing that, the next step is actively monitoring your own thought in situations where you have a propensity to rely on intuition. So for instance, I did not learn physics at all in high school, and I never took physics in college. but I needed to learn physics in order to write about it as part of this intuitive theories literature. And every time I talked about physics, I was always so self-aware of my language because I was worried that I was going to then just spout out the intuitive theory where I was trying to get people to contrast that with the scientific theory. So being very mindful of my own misconceptions, I think, led to a lot of growth in that area.
So it means essentially you're saying being self-critical about the decisions you make or conclusions that you come to. It's tough to do this consistently throughout our entire life, but at points it's worthwhile to be skeptical and do some self-analysis or self-thinking is what you're suggesting.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I think our current social movement surrounding Black Lives Matter is all about that, getting well-intentioned people to recognize that in this situation, there's certain biases that you're bringing to bear.
I understood. Yeah, I think there's some of the biases that somebody talked about the earlier question. Definitely that comes in a little bit as well. Mm-hmm. And I think the second part of the question was about, how do these intuitive theories come about? I know you referred to some ways we can acquire them. Maybe you can just summarize them a little bit or give an example.
Yeah, it's going to end up being domain specific.
Yeah,
and it's each theory has its own story. So intuitive theories of the physical world often originate very early. Like, we're talking about like preschool years. As kids have like innate biases to understand matter and heat and light in certain ways, and then they'll have certain experiences, etc. Other theories get developed actually more through cultural input. So for instance, we have intuitive theories of evolution that I kind of hinted at the beginning, where we think about it in more linear terms than branching terms. It's not like children construct these ideas because they don't even know things evolve, right? We don't see evolution in our daily lives, but evolution is part of our culture. There are depictions of it in books, on television, at museums. We use the word, it's co-opted to talk about Pokemon. So there's lots of cases where we encounter the idea, but natural selection, the true understanding of how evolution works, is foreign to us. And so we develop these alternative views, but that will end up being sort of later in life. And again, the input is going to look different for that domain than, say, the physical world.
Yeah, I think I like the concept that you talked about. The way to think about this is it's really a manuscript that is written over, right? So it means the intuitive theories, even though you correct them or you attempt to correct them, there is a legacy of that thinking still left behind. That was a great analogy, and the example about physicists trying to struggle with the right answers is also interesting. So there is a question about, I think it's sort of like falls down into some of the causal versus correlative thinking. I'll rephrase the question because it's not very clear to me. The question is, in healthcare, there are examples of folk practices that are, that seem to work, right? Mm-hmm. How important is it that people understand the causal steps if you're mistaking them for correlative effects? Meaning sometimes the practice itself works, but maybe not the way we're thinking about it, if I understand the question correctly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a great example of this are the list of prescriptions we've been given for combating coronavirus. So everywhere you go, they say, wear a mask, social distance, and wash your hands. So first of all, like, washing your hands is not on par with the other two when it comes to preventing coronavirus, given that we know about how it's transmitted. But it's generally a good thing to do, right? So it's not like you should dissuade people from doing that, but it can also, but teaching people more about the specific pathway of transmission for the specific virus might lead to more emphasis on, say, the more effective approaches rather than the less effective ones. Then when it comes to the effective approaches, it's great if people would just wear a mask and they don't have to be battered into doing it. But then you can also develop this false understanding that the practice of wearing a mask is in some way beneficial or healthful, where it's only about preventing the spread of the virus. But if you have this sort of funny view that it's helpful to you, then you forget that actually it's a public health measure, and it's spreading the two-way transmission from others to you, but you to others. So like, it might change sort of the consistency with which you wear the mask, or the appropriateness of your wearing of the situation to the mask wearing. I think there's general patterns that you want to encourage, but if you have the underlying biological knowledge, you apply those behaviors even better.
Yeah, understood. Great. Yeah, I think somebody called it pandemic theater, right? The concept of, washing hands is one you mentioned. We used to, last year at this time, we were all trying to clear our mail and sanitize mail. So
Right.
a lot of that was going on. I think some of that consistently, it's still being done, because it's, in a way, it feels like it's going to protect us. But again, we found out as our understanding of the virus evolved. Good. I think especially the pandemic is a good example of how some of our scientific theories evolved, and how a little bit of the lag in our theories, or our adherence to the theories and understanding are following along.
Definitely.
There is a question about schooling system. I don't know about the Dewey. They're saying the proposed educational approach that you highlighted, right, is exactly what John Dewey described a long time ago. Question is, any evaluation of the Dewey-based schooling versus other scientific understanding of how to teach, I guess?
In my own academic upbringing, John Dewey wasn't a figure that was mentioned, like within psychology. My guess is that in the world of education, he's probably a prominent figure. In some ways, there was a real disservice that was done by people latching onto Jean Piaget, who is a central figure in cognitive development. He discovered lots of amazing things. He had great ideas, but it led to this weird view of children going through stages that are so absolute, and it led people to decide not to teach young kids certain things because they just weren't at that stage of reasoning. And also, I think that's probably the biggest problem, which is, if you think about learning from a domain-specific point of view, that we develop theories in different domains, then there's no reason you can't teach an elementary schooler about evolution or mechanics. These are topics that typically are reserved until high school, but there's usually like a Piagetian justification for avoiding going over topics that are just too complicated for young kids. It's certainly the case that young kids will have trouble learning these concepts just like high schoolers do, but there's no reason to wait.
Yep, understood. The next question is about again, related to teaching. Will it help learners or students if teachers talk specifically about how scientific evidence is contrary to that prior intuition, right? It's like either the parabolic or the forces that we talk about. You did give examples. I think the question is getting to, how do we effectively overcome the gap between the scientific evidence and the intuitive understanding?
That by recognizing that the gap exists and
it's real.
Framing education as an explicit attempt to bridge that gap. The activities I talked about that were ineffective, like problem sets and interacting with microworlds, etc., they're only ineffective if they're not part of a curriculum, where at the beginning of the curriculum, the problems are laid out, and then those teaching tools are related to the problems, the reasoning problems. And you get students to take a meta view of their own understanding in comparison to the way the reasoning that's being modeled for them. It's a mistake to think that if we just plop students down in front of a microworld, they're going to discover Newton's principles. Yeah. They don't discover Newton's principles in the real world, even though the real world operates in terms of Newtonian laws. So that there has to be the teacher has to guide their way through these activities.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the reason why. I mean, it took until Galileo to figure out, right? The parabolic arc that you were showing, it's a great example. Prior physicists essentially showed that going all the way down, they saw the evidence with their own mind. As you said, they were either misinterpreting it or misconstruing it as though other factors are impinging. Yeah, it's tough to do that. Plus, in a classroom, again, it's even more difficult. The next question is, have you positioned your book to science teachers? Yeah, I think obviously it's a great, the message is particularly relevant to them. The interesting part of the question is, how about entry-level philosophy students grappling with epistemology? So maybe we can start with defining what epistemology is, so that every time I look up the word, I get it, and then 5 minutes later, I forgot about it. Maybe we can start with the definition and then answer the question.
Oh, sure. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. Yeah, I actually haven't really thought about how intuitive theories provide a new angle onto I'm sure epistemologists have thought about sort of lay knowledge. I'd be thrilled if philosophers found my book useful. I'm part of several societies that intersect philosophy, psychology, and philosophy. As for science teachers, I've tried my best. If you guys have suggestions as to how to get in touch with science teachers, what's kind of unfortunate, there's always a disconnect between the academic study of these topics and then how the topics are actually implemented in the real world at the ground level. So there's plenty of things that psychologists know about teaching and learning that it's hard to translate into real life situations. But there's also like organizations out there that are explicitly think tanks that are all about improving education, and they're making the bridge between the teachers in the schools and the people doing research on teaching and learning to try to develop curricula. I think that might be one of the best ways, is to develop a curriculum that takes into account intuitive theories, and rather than ask teachers to come up with this on their own, give them these tools that are already informed by the science.
Yeah, understood. Again, I think some of this is a little tough to do in a broadcast, right? You're teaching 30 kids. This is where 1:1 instruction and spending that 1:1 time addressing their specific questions might be helpful. So the next question, this is a good one. Did Einstein use intuitive theoretical thinking before his theories were proven experimentally, right? Einstein always had his, what they used to call Jedi Genkin or something. I forgot my physics. And then the other aspect that they are following through is, and when he incorrectly rejected aspects of quantum mechanics, right? Was that based on intuition as well? A two-part question, very interesting topic.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with Einstein's own theorizing, but this question does bring up another sense of intuition that might have been in the back of your mind, which is expert intuition. Isn't the part of the reason that we want to develop expertise in a domain is to change our intuitions about that domain? And there's definitely evidence that happens, that experts think about topics differently than novices. But interestingly, the influence of expertise seems to be limited to the context of the practice. So scientists think very differently from novices in the lab or maybe at a professional meeting. But out in the real world, they oftentimes will default to the same intuitive theories that they held prior to learning their scientific expertise, the domain of their expertise. So in terms of Einstein, I'm sure he had well-honed physical intuitions that novices don't hold, but he was human too. So maybe there are cases where there are certain intuitive theories that limited his theorizing. Science is slow, right? It took humans hundreds of years to develop these theories, and that's true in the lifetime of a scientist too. That it takes them decades to hit upon some of their major discoveries.
Yeah. I think in the case of Einstein, you're right. I think the expert intuition that you talked about is clearly there. One interesting example is when he developed special relativity, which came in earlier. He actually rejected the concept of space-time that was developed by somebody else, and then he gradually accepted it. But then that became the basis for general relativity, right? So it means, like you said, his expert intuition actually evolved based on development of the theory, experimentation, and helped him do. But again, the same intuition essentially failed him to the second part of the question about quantum mechanics. Absolutely. I think his expert intuition in that domain essentially failed him. I think it failed most people because we still grapple with this, with that, even to this day. And we don't understand
I
it.
should add that people have done diary studies of Newton's early thinking, and he started out as an impetus theory. He writes about internal motive forces before he figures out, inertia, and then there's no more need for impetus to explain patterns of motion.
Yeah, that's a very interesting call out. I mean, obviously, everybody has those false intuitive theories. How do you essentially correct them? To your point, right? Recognize the gap. Your answer to the previous question: recognize that there is a gap and fix it. Error correction would be the key. The next question is, can you elaborate about intuitive misconceptions about genes and gene theory, right? I mean, what exactly falters us with intuitive theories about this space?
Sure. So we intuitively understand traits at basically the level of the trait itself, that people have different traits and those traits get passed on to their offspring, and then the underlying mechanisms are all vague. And so we tend to think in more what's known as essentialist terms. We think there's an essence that underlies a particular species. So like tigers have a kind of essence that's different from lions, and lions have their own essence. And the essence is conferred to an organism when it's born, and it will ensure that organism develops species typical traits. So even if a baby lion was given to tigers to be raised, it's not going to turn out to look like a tiger or act like a tiger. It will still be a lion. These are intuitions that even like 3-year-olds have. They don't use the word essence. They also don't use the word genes or genetics, but there's just this common sense idea of an inner nature that is inborn and shapes development. And that's kind of quasi-compatible with genes, because genes do comprise an inner nature, but there's so many aspects of genetics that defy an essentialist understanding. Like genes are not all or nothing. They interact in large networks. Genes are not directly coding traits. They code proteins, and there's usually a whole cascade of biological reactions and so forth that lead to the manifestation of trait. So there's so many details about how traits are actually encoded and then manifest that matter when you actually want to understand, what different patterns of inheritance, the malleability of a trait. And if you don't have that detailed biochemical understanding, you're just going to default to this childhood notion of an essence.
Yep. I think that can definitely lead us astray. That's a good call out. The next question, I think you already had an interesting compliment. You say, the questioner says, you persuaded me. Awesome, great job. So in your academic space, what is called out as the weakest or most controversial aspect of your ideas? And I think they're referring to that, is it this, which is particularly that we lay knowledge over intuition, meaning the overwriting, like the manuscript example you mentioned, rather than replacing intuition?
No, actually, that seems to be pretty well established at this point. There's now probably 2 decades worth of evidence suggesting that this is the case, using a large variety of tools, like measuring how quickly people respond, how accurately they respond, what's going on in their brain, how they can be primed in one context versus another. And it looks like every domain you look at, you can find evidence of these early intuitions interfering with scientific reasoning. So I wouldn't say that's the most controversial. I think the most controversial aspect of this work is just the notion of an intuitive theory itself. There are some people that don't believe we should be thinking about naive knowledge in those terms. They think that naive knowledge is perhaps sparser, perhaps less coherent, that it is more of just like a random collection of misconceptions. In fact, the whole notion of misconception is also sometimes debated, because the idea is that we have preconceptions, but not truly misconceptions, and that you do a disservice to science learners if you label their ideas as misconceptions. They're actually preconceptions that you can harness and develop more fully in the science classroom. And my response is like, that's definitely true. Sometimes there are preconceptions that you can think of as proto-scientific and you can work with them. But there's other preconceptions that really should be labeled as misconceptions. Impetus is a great example. There's no role for impetus in modern theories. And by modern, I mean since 1700s and beyond. Those theories of physics, it's a fiction. It doesn't exist. So I think that the hard work is going to end up being domain specific, theory specific, figuring out what conceptual resources students have that can be used and built upon, and what ideas need to be challenged and discarded. They're not going to be erased, but moved to the side.
Yeah, I think that's partly, I think it's one of the reasons why even when quantum mechanics or something like that came about, even with evolution, right, going from Lamarckian to Darwinian models became a matter of years and years and years. And even biologists at the top of their form could not make the transition. It has to be done over time and slowly, overwrite that modeling, I guess. So I think one more question. I do want to talk a little bit about, you talked about, a lot of us have misconceptions about various things. Is this unique to, your political bias, for example, or left, people on the left, do they have less, misconceptions than people on the right? I know obviously this is very evident these days with our environment amplified by the pandemic.
Right.
Where do people go wrong, and how often do people go wrong along the political spectrum?
We're all predisposed to the same intuitive theories. Like when I mentioned it's culturally universal, it's also typically pretty widespread within a culture.
Yeah.
But that there might be some interesting differences in who embraces their intuitions and will not let them go and think that they're right, versus people who are open to changing their minds. I'd like to say it's like a left-right divide, but there's many misconceptions that are actually held more strongly by liberals than by conservatives. I mean, it was the case that anti-vaxxers were much more likely to be liberal than conservative. Now that doesn't seem to be true anymore. But another example that might still hold is like genetically modified foods, that more opposition on the left than there was on the right. But the politics, it comes and goes. There's not an obvious connection.
Yeah.
The only obvious connection is that there's going to be certain ideas that are always hard for people to understand, and that's always potentially subject to political pressures. But how it plays out with a particular political party in a particular moment is hard to know.
So it means we are all equal offenders in a way. That's what you're saying. And does it actually, you know what, I have a question, but there's something else came up. I do want to give the last, this is going to be the last question. Can you speculate about intuitive resistance to COVID vaccinations, a theory about resistance?
Yeah, I mean, this is a case where I think the main impetus, to use that word, is political pressure, taking advantage of a situation that people just generally don't understand. People don't know what a vaccine is and how it works. The most common model for a non-biologist is that it's like an antidote to the disease. And on that view, like, if you had COVID, it would be effective to inject you with a vaccine because it would just directly counteract COVID. People don't understand that it's a way of stimulating the immune system. They don't understand what the stimulant is, what's actually being injected into you. So given that there's all this confusion about what a vaccine is, if there's someone a group that comes in and tries to create mistrust and distrust of the institutions giving the vaccine, that distrust will find a place among the confusion. But if instead it's just a regular thing that you do, it's vaccines are a part of life. We need to trust the medical establishment. Go get your vaccine. Then it wouldn't be controversial. Unfortunately, it happened to be one of those issues that got politicized, probably because COVID, previously was politicized.
Yeah. I think the pump was primed, so to speak, unfortunately. So, Andrew, thank you very much. That was a great talk. I mean, talking about all of this intuitive theory, etc., reminds me of a great quote by Carl Sagan. I think a presenter was asking them, what is your thinking about aliens, right? Alien life out there. Carl Sagan said, yeah, we don't have the evidence in. The interviewer pushed. He said, what does your gut say? And Carl, responds, I do not think with my gut. That was his response. I thought that was hilarious and timely, where he basically completely overrode that intuitive element, which we, I think to a certain extent, idolize as intuition or sixth sense or gut, Great, thank you. So appreciate your talk and thanks for patience addressing the questions. The book is available. And thank you for graciously agreeing to share details of that experiment that somebody asked about. We'll get your email out to them. So with that said, let's talk about some of the upcoming programs as well as coffee hour that's coming up. So after this is over, we have a virtual coffee hour, much like every week. You can get the link to that. We'll be doing this on Zoom at ethicalhumanistsociety.org/coffee hour. Please do that. There is an EHS community chat on Wednesday, April 28th in the evening. Again, a Zoom session, so you have the link there. You go to our website, you'll be able to get the link if you're not able to note this down. So after that, let's talk about programs that are coming up over the next few weeks. On April 25th, a Chicago native, Gavin Van Horn, is going to be giving a talk about, the title is Shared Journeys with Trickster Coyotes, much in the form of the Wile E. Coyote we talked about. The talk is really, Gavin is actually a creative director at Center for Humans and Nature. And he wrote a book with this title called The Way of the Coyote, Shared Journeys in the Urban Wilds. Gavin explores what it means to coexist with urban wildlife, a great interest of mine. Drawing from the wisdom of wildlife ecologist Aldo Leopold, Taoist philosopher Lao Tzu, and the North American trickster figure Coyote. I see coyotes near my house all the time, love them. I think it'll be an interesting talk that, please tune in next week for that at the same time. And then the week after that, we will have another topical program, David Vessel, Speaking Truth to Power, Journalism and Social Media. Interesting. Anything social is obviously very controversial. So it'll be interesting to talk about how do they interact, journalism, and like, for example, the recent fight between Australia and Facebook, something along those lines we should be able to hear more about. David is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who spent 30 years at the Wall Street Journal, and he's at the Brookings Institute right now. He's a frequent contributor to NPR's Morning Edition. He will discuss how public intellectuals and journalists have had to adapt to the rise of social media and the shouting matches on cable TV. That'll be interesting. So please join us on May 2nd. For more information about other topics that are coming up and other events, go to ethicalhumanistsociety.org. We're also on social media, but we don't have any controversial topics. We are available on Facebook as well as Twitter. We also have a lot of our talks archived on YouTube. Feel free to go and look at past talks and details about future programs that are coming up. With that said, I think there was one more thing I wanted to mention as a way to cap today's talk, a great talk by Andrew Schulman. Thank you again for him. I remember one quote by Richard Feynman. I think when it comes to some of the intuitive thinking, what he said is, when we think about theories of the world and evidence and how the world works, he said the easiest person is to fool yourself. It's easy to overlook our own intuitive thinking, like one of the questions somebody asked about. So I think that's the part we need to really be, confronting head on, like Andrew reemphasized. So with that said, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of the beautiful Sunday. We'll see you soon.